Joined by a guest today is a trailblazer when it comes to the world of psychology, leadership and development. Is the one and only Dr. Samina Shaheem. How are you?
Hi, Johnny. I'm fine. Thank you very much for inviting me to have this conversation with you.
From my understanding, you've got a PhD, you're a professor of psychology, organizational behavior and leadership. You work with complex organizations to develop their leadership skills and to accelerate gender equality, as well as being a behavioral science advisor. You have a motto, and that's living by design. Explain more about that.
Yes, living by design. What would be the opposite of that, Johnny? Would be living by default. I noticed that throughout my career, I was able to very early on differentiate between those who live by design and those who live by default. What do I mean by that? We all are shaped by different forces, whether it's society, whether it's parents, family, culture, religion, traditions, whatever it may be. We get shaped by those. I have the kitty cat wants to come in. Can you hear the cat meowing?
Yeah. We've got that. This is me and her cat.
Yeah. Yes. You got me. See, here is evidence and case point.
Wow.
Who was right here to say hello? He is a rag doll. Is a rag doll? Yeah. And they're lovely. They're so playful, but they very similar to what I was saying earlier. They operate on default modalities. And that means when they want something, they want it now on autopilot. So as I was telling you, in regards to what does it mean to live a life by design? So as we're getting shaped by society, parents, experiences, family, all these variables coming at us, at times we might slip into who we are rather than sculpt who we are. And oftentimes when you don't have a blueprint of who you are, you end up slipping into other people's blueprints and being or doing things that may not be core to your authentic self. So living a life by design means being awake, being wakeful to your authentic self. Who am I? What are my values? What are my goals and objectives? How do those align with my overall life purpose and my power? It is becoming the architect of your present and of your future, and not an archaeologist of your past. Because oftentimes people spend a lot of time digging about their past experiences, what they've gone through. I refer to that practice or to that habit, a bad habit, because it's probably the worst use of our imagination to ruminate over past things that have happened. But I call that being an archaeologist of the past. Except, Johnny, the only difference is archaeologists often stumble upon quite valuable artifacts that give us incredible insights into our history. Whereas when you are ruminating and just digging away without processing it effectively, without really changing the narrative, without resetting and reframing what happened, you're not going to find anything valuable. So living by design means looking at those experiences, retaining the lessons, but releasing the pain and really applying what you understand through what you've gone through, what your present is about, knowing to really focus on things that we have and things that we control, and not really wasting that much energy on things that we can't control. Would be being awake and more aware of how much of an author, how much of a designer we are in regards to our own life.
Yeah, so many good points there, because you don't want to outsource the pen for someone else to write your story. And for so many, I think they do live in the past, what might have been, what could have been, that kind of it. But the thing about if, it never comes, because the past doesn't need you, right?
Yeah.
But your future does. And this whole new life by design, I like it. So in this podcast, we're going to talk a lot about well-being and mental health, which has a large part of living a happy and fulfilled life and a life that you want to live. Because
Yeah.
without your mental health, without your well-being, there is no health. So why do you think
Right.
when we've come so far in terms of society, technology, ways of communicating with each other, that we're now, according to studies and polls, especially since COVID, that in the US and the UK and other societies are experiencing a mental health crisis, and it's applied a lot in work. I wrote an article about that in Forbes, where it's top 7 signs to watch out for whether your job is putting you into an early grave, because what affects you in your professional life has a big effect on your personal life and vis-a-vis. So why do you think that there is this sense of a mental health crisis more than ever before?
I would challenge that. And I would say we are more aware of the mental health crisis. And I think that those people who are more aware of it are talking about it more. People are getting more help for it. It's not that these issues never existed before. Every generation has gone through their own sort of mental health crises, depending on the socio-political levels. Can you imagine what the human spirit has endured throughout history? All kinds of oppression, all kinds of dark ages, wars, famine, pandemics, and so on and so forth. Lots of different things that have very much weighed heavily on our psychological makeup. And there is no doubt that mental health is health, Johnny. It's impossible to separate the two. And I think in the last few decades, especially in the last 40, 50 years, we've learned to appreciate that fact that you can't talk about holistic health. You can't talk about health without including the concept of mental health. Now, for a very long time, because mental health is not as tangible, not as measurable, remember, in relation to the sort of journey or the development, the evolution of mental health, it's still quite in its early stages. We have made lots more advances when it comes to studies in relation to physical health. But we have incredible research, great data in the last 100 years, but the scientific modalities of extracting research and leaning on empirical information to base our decisions and our understanding is relatively new in comparison to physical health issues. As of last few decades, many more people are invested in making sure that we're doing empirical research to better understand what mental health is, and not on a narrative basis or a case study basis, but really large population samples. Now, Johnny, I'm a cross-cultural psychologist, and I'm fascinated by the impact culture has on our behaviors. What does depression look like in New York versus Nepal versus Norway? It's impossible for us to have one universal global definition or experience of these mental health concepts. And when I was at university, I slowly started realizing this. It was my first year of university. I was in my intro to psychology class in the United States, in California, where I was studying. And some of the things that they were talking about as universal truths seemed a little bit off to me as an Iranian who grew up in the diaspora. I've never lived in Iran, but still our families back, once you get home in your private spheres of life, what is considered normal may be very different to my neighbor and my little friend Heidi, who lived next door to me. Some of our differences were quite pronounced. So I started looking at the fact, I started looking into cross-cultural psychology. And then when I studied this subject, Johnny, it was like a fringe, peripheral topic that people were would get engaged in a dark, dingy university underground cafes that they may have discussions about before it became more mainstream. And you also have the complexities of culture. And in many cultures, the response is what? What do you mean you're depressed? You have a roof on your head, you have food on the table, get on with it. What is that all about? When I was your age, I had to walk 10 miles to my school and I didn't have food to eat and I didn't have all the toys you have. The stigma surrounding mental health and the understanding and the experience of mental health across different cultures, which is very different, has resulted in a situation in which we have varying degrees of understanding and involvement and varying degrees of solutions being available for those communities and for those people to use it. In other words, what I'm referring to is the stigma surrounding mental health. Still, in many cultures, Shawnee, when people want to seek out mental health support, there's a lot of shame and guilt associated with how can I go and speak to a stranger about my issues? And there's a secrecy that still surrounds this. There's a lack of trust about how can this be helpful to me anyways? What am I going to gain as a result of this? And I have empathy for that because think about it, Johnny. If you break your arm, you go to the A&E, they take an x-ray of your arm, see where the fractures are, what the problem is. They put a cast on your arm. You're uncomfortable for 6 to 8 weeks. What's going on? And you know how you're healing. You've got some painkillers. Your friends make fun of you or maybe write funny things on your cast for you. And then you're good to go. But I want you to imagine for a second, how do we sit in front of another individual without any particular biological metrics or measures and to describe what it means to be desperate or hopeless or in despair or vulnerable, or the fact that I feel psychologically homeless in that I feel disconnected from myself and others. How do I return to me? These are very abstract concepts that are sometimes difficult for us to quantify. We may not have the right semantics yet. We may not have the right language around it. We're getting better. And the more sort of words that we find and the more we work with children for them to learn how important it is for them to be able to express what they're feeling, express what their emotions are, then the more conscientious we can become to capture individuals' experiences within a mental health domain. And when we capture it, we're able to study it, then we're able to understand it better and hopefully have more solutions for those who are in need.
Yeah, so many things to unpack there. Because help is the bravest word in the English dictionary. And culturally, men at times struggle with that. Good at bravado, good at banter, but still not always good with touchy-feely stuff in terms of emotions. So you bottle it. And entrepreneurs, there's some research done by Michael Freeman at University of San Francisco along with Berkeley, where he said that entrepreneurs are 50% more likely to suffer a mental health condition. And that's because of a lot of pressure. 9 out of 10 businesses fail within the first 5 or 6 years. And culturally, even in the UK, although we've come a long way, there used to be an expression, "Oh man, what's the matter with you?"
What's the matter with you?
Yeah. And culturally as well, even in the Middle East, I lived in Dubai and I'm half British, half Iranian. A lot of people know that. And still, it's way behind in a lot of stuff compared to the UK and the US in understanding certain bits, whether it's gender lines or just understanding it's okay to cry at times. We're all human first. That doesn't mean you cry all the time at work all the time, but there's always a time and place for everything, but yet you don't. I think a lot of people, in my opinion, spend most of their life being misunderstood. And they bottle things, they keep things because they think, oh, if I show that side to me, people will think less of me. They'll think I'm weak. Whereas there's a big difference between vulnerability which takes a lot of courage, and showing weakness, which people can prey upon. And when you talk about these cultural lines and how it is, do you think that this whole stick that there used to be a lot around mental health, that even in the 50s or 60s, if you said anything like that, people would think, oh, she's crazy, or he's crazy, or they put him in some kind of psychiatric center or a mental home, they used to call it.
Are we stick methods, things that plus those nightmare films?
Yeah. So where do you think we are still with that in terms of as a society, or a lot of places of work, for example, they talk about where we're all about mental health and being, it's very important to us. But the mission statement always doesn't reflect the realities. How far are we down the line to where we need to be in understanding why mental health is so important, both for Shaheem and
the stigma around mental health is so multifaceted, and it's deeply ingrained in issues of traditions and culture and so on. So teasing those out from one another is super interesting, but it's hard work, right? And it arises from, I would say, a combination of fear, lack of knowledge, perhaps stereotypes, some limiting beliefs, and even historical misconceptions of, oh, if you're feeling this way, then you might be possessed by the devil, or that there's things that have happened that your ancestors have done, and now you're paying the price for those ancestral sins. There are some very highly, deeply ingrained stereotypes, misconceptions, distortions, right? And so historically, mental health disorders were misunderstood, and there's many still today that we don't fully understand, right? And I think what did us most damage, Johnny, was that it was either mental health issues were either associated with the supernatural, so something that they couldn't understand, they couldn't identify, and therefore it's not measurable, and there's nothing we can do for you other than take you to holy people for them to chant over your head or have their sort of alternative or conventional methods of treatment. So that was one layer of it. The other layer of it was that mental health issues was related to weakness or moral failure. And that did more damage for the rest of the globe. Those people who were able to disconnect from those supernatural ideas and tendencies, we can move over that much faster than, why am I so weak? Why can't I just shake this off? Why am I a bad person because I'm experiencing this kind of burnout or anxiety or these disorders? And that idea of weakness and moral failure really led to the marginalization and mistreatment of individuals with mental health conditions, to the point in which sometimes they'd be locked up in the attic of their house and completely separated from society, right? And I have to say, though, we've made great progress in recent years, even though the stigma persists due to this lack of fear and the unknown. But certainly we've moved away. And when I say we, Johnny, please understand, we can't generalize everybody. By that, North America, Canada, the United States, Western Europe, and Australia, even in those countries, we still have a long way to go. But still, we have made great progress in combating mental health stigma in terms of promoting education around it, advocacy, increasing public awareness about the prevalence and treatability of mental health disorders. We can't discount all the work that has been done in that space. And even though sometimes it seems like a box-ticking exercise in organizations and corporations or in schools, it starts cultural change, mindset change begins with a discussion about what this is, an evaluation of what this is, a transformation of looking at mental health through new lenses. And unless we do that first, we're not going to get into the practical application of it, right? So when you think about new concepts, think about it in terms of, first we study it, we understand it, we raise awareness about it, we broadcast it, then it goes into, now that we have that knowledge, how do we apply it? Okay. And sometimes, I'm sure you've noticed, as well as I have, social media has now ran with this on a level that is absolutely unprecedented. Okay. Which comes with the good and the bad. The good is it's helping in raising awareness, but unfortunately, they're also helping in raising misinformation. Okay. So you've got amateurs and experts juxtaposed next to each other on social media, talking about what you should do when you have attention deficit disorder and hyperactivity. Everybody now knows these abbreviations: OCD, ADD, ADHD, on the spectrum. He's narcissistic. She's bipolar. We cannot generalize and weaponize the knowledge that we are gaining from a mental health point of view the same way we wouldn't do it with cancer or Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. Would we ever say to someone, "What's wrong with you? Did you have Parkinson's?" We would never do that. And I think that, unfortunately, on the journey of raising awareness about mental health issues, we have to accept this as a byproduct of those individuals who are well-intended and wanting to help. But at the same time, we have to be highly conscientious and cognizant of the fact that when the hashtag mental health has been used more than 3 billion times across different social media platforms, and about 92% of information surrounding mental health topics on TikTok is inaccurate or problematic or even dangerous, we have a problem. There's something to be worried about and concerned about.
That's shocking. 3 billion.
Yeah.
And 92%.
Now, let me, because I'm an academic, and I must never refer to statistics without making sure my statistics are accurate. So I'm going to make sure I've got the right. Yes. Okay. So social media has helped us, platforms such as Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and that's great. So this has become so prevalent that the hashtag mental health on TikTok has accumulated approximately, I was grossly under the right number. TikTok has accumulated approximately 75 billion views and more than 46 million posts on Instagram. Okay. And this trend is of this incredible magnitude that it lends itself to us discussing it. And so what are the drawbacks? Research has found that 83.7% of mental health advice on TikTok is misleading, and about 14.2% of videos include content that could be potentially dangerous or damaging. Apparently, 100% of the content for ADHD contains misleading information of the most of the condition in our analysis. And content covering bipolar disorder and depression were also found to be highly misleading, 94%. This is quite alarming for someone who has spent the last 25 years of their career studying, teaching, working in the space of mental health and advocacy. But again, let me highlight, we know that there's a stigma and we know that we need to raise awareness about it. But now we have to become more conscientious of how to separate fact from fiction when it comes to social media.
Yeah, and clout as well, that people use that because they think they might go viral.
Yeah.
You think that
Yeah.
there's intentionality behind it.
Yes. Exactly. And people ask me, Johnny, they say, why don't you put more stories up? Or why don't you put more videos? Or I'm an academic learning and development professional. You'll never see me jumping around up and down and pointing to boxes. And I'm not involved in psycho entertainment or pop psychology. And I use the space as well as I can. Sometimes my content might seem less entertaining than others, but I think it's very important we have an ethical and moral responsibility to make sure that we're broadcasting information that is accurate and empirical.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about some of the stuff you were saying, because even personally, on my mother's side, my granddad, his father, this is probably looking at 1920s, 30s. He had a nervous breakdown. And at that time, there was no real understanding of mental health or well-being.
Mm.
And apparently he was such a gentle guy, used to play the piano, etc. in Scotland. My granddad never really talked about it. They never did. They were of the wartime generation. It's a generation in its well mental health because it was different times. Oh, let's not talk about it. Let's not talk about the war. And it's only when he got much older that he started to talk about stuff. Maybe it was through my mother who told me. And he said one thing they always remembered was they had a picnic in the grounds of that institution. And his dad just wasn't allowed to see them. He had 8 kids. And all he remembered was seeing his dad through the window, just waving as they ate their lunch and tried to be as close to him as possible. Very sad. And then, so from that extreme to where we are now, it's a million miles apart in the UK, for example.
Yeah.
And in the US and other Western countries, I think just generally. But I think loneliness is more than ever before. I think people are yearning connection more than ever before, which then those two areas very much fuel well-being and mental health. They say loneliness is more dangerous to your health than smoking cigarettes in terms of your longevity and your lifespan. Because I suppose is that isolation. So although we have more opportunities than ever before to communicate like we are now on this podcast or social audio, social media, we're not developing as deep and as meaningful connections. That's the soul and the spirit the human being requires. Generally, not all, generally, which may be one of the epidemics which is fueling this mental health crisis that we've been seeing, is that sense of isolation and loneliness. What's your thoughts?
I like that you framed it within looking at how much of an impact it can have on us, this concept of loneliness and this phenomena of loneliness. Of course, Johnny, after the pandemic and during the pandemic, this was a very important and significant topic to be explored because of those individuals who had to isolate themselves socially. And even this concept of social distancing. So it would, I wish we had come up with a better term, something like physical distancing rather than social distancing, because that idea of social distancing created a sensation of we have to not only be separate physically, but from our social network, from our tribe, from our community and support system. And if I can take you back a few thousands of years, so let's go back many blue moons ago, philosophers, Socrates, for example, or Aristotle, I think said this. He said, we are social creatures. Anybody who claims otherwise is either a deity or a beast. And throughout history, there's been incredible people, authors, philosophers, and so on, who have decided to retrieve into their caves and into isolation because they are disgusted and disillusioned by the ills of society. Henry Thoreau, for example, one of the individuals who, if you're interested in reading, Walden is one of his books, and he decided to retreat into a cabin and live a life of isolation. And he wrote some of his incredible poems and books and things while in that. Now, I'm going to take you back to that quote that I referred to. By and large, there are those people who may decide to retrieve into their isolation, and other people who face themselves in circumstances of loneliness and isolation due to life experiences, choices that they've made, or decisions that they've made, or certain interpersonal skills that they have or they don't have. Now, because we have a sense of we have such a deep sense of belonging and the need for belonging and a need for inclusivity. That comes with also a need for approval. Okay. So in order for you to be connected with others, you need their approval and you need to conform and you need to live by those social structures, systems of livings and models of reality. Johnny, today more than ever, people are questioning those systems of living, that point of conformity and blind obedience. They are embracing their authenticity and their individualism, which means that my being and health may be placed above that of the group or above that of my family. I remember once speaking to a Japanese colleague of mine who was very unhappy in their relationship and in their marriage. And when I asked them, and this was in a non-consultation session, we were talking as two friends. And when I asked her, have you ever thought about separating or divorcing? You have endured this toxic, traumatic relationship for 10, 15 years. And she looked at me and she said, Samina, it's not about me. It's about my family. It's about my children. It's about my neighbors. It's about my community. It's about my society. It's about my traditions. It's about my religion. It's about my country. What would happen if everyone started thinking about themselves and just decided they wanted to appease themselves, right? And that very much in a super interesting way highlighted this difference between what's more important to me, modeling the way for who I am and designing a path for who I am in an authentic way, which incidentally, Johnny, may be a lonely experience, because once you start going down that road, you may not have as many friends. You may not be able to work in certain industries or companies. You may choose to become an entrepreneur, as difficult as it may be. You shed yourself of certain support systems because you may now see them as the fact that you're conforming or that you don't want to necessarily be dependent on them. I'm quite fascinated at looking at loneliness from that angle and what happens to these people who now have this inner conflict between themselves where they want to attach, they want to bond, they want to be part of a community, but perhaps not under their rules. And there's a great expression that says, if you don't belong, don't be long. If you don't belong somewhere, don't stay too long. Because the more you try and make it work, the more you try and be something that you're not, the more you fit into somebody else's blueprint, as we talked about, that default modality, the further you go from yourself. And I tell you something, Johnny, in the experience of research and talking to different people and all these years that I've been in this, loneliness is a concept and phenomena that can exist when you're surrounded by hundreds of people, thousands of people. It's a mindset. And when you are further away from yourself, the further away you are from you, meaning your goals, your values, your plans for the future, your passion, your purpose, your power, the further you are from that, the lonelier you will be, even if you're surrounded by thousands of people. And so I think it's very important for us to think about incidents of how lonely we feel when we're in a job that isn't aligned with our passion or purpose, or working with individuals that we don't want to struggle with to achieve a particular something. When you're in a relationship, I think the loneliest I've ever been was when I was in a relationship. That person was perfect on paper, but perhaps not good for me. And that was the furthest I felt from myself and the loneliest I'd ever felt, even though I was surrounded by friends and family and so on and so forth. So really, those individuals who are physically isolated from others, we have to understand what is the root cause of it. And if the root cause is choice, then that's a whole different discussion. If the root cause is behavioral. So meaning my attitude or the way that I behave. A lot of people wait for others to reach out to them. You ask them, when was the last time you made some effort to try and call a friend to go out together and have a meal? They're worried about rejection. Remember what I was telling you earlier about that sense of belonging and that need for attachment and community? They're so worried about rejection that they may not even be proactive and initiate contact because they're worried about being pushed away or rejected. We could dedicate months to this subject. And I think it's even more important, Johnny, today for our generation, because loneliness is so prevalent amongst the aging population, and people are no longer dying at 55 or 50 or younger. We're enjoying longevity, and with longevity and living longer comes with an experience of what does that mean for us as a society in order to take care of our elders? What does it mean in certain cultures versus others? We come from a Middle Eastern culture, and we don't, or again, we can't generalize. Some people do. Perhaps we have different values and traditions around care facilities for the elders, or what do they used to call them? Old folks' homes is what they were referred to in the 80s and the 90s. And a lot of people may be living with their family members. Some people may not want to live with their kids because they're hugely independent and have always been, and therefore don't want to impose on their children. But they may have lost their partner. They no longer have their spouse. Their network of friends may have also expired and passed away. And so I think that loneliness can impact a teenager, a 17-year-old, can impact a person in a marriage and a successful job, or it can impact someone who's later in life. Context is important to understand the differences surrounding that experience.
Yeah. And it reminded me of a story I was once told about an elderly person and how she used to put her chair near the window, which was looking out onto the street, because it was the only way of her actually seeing people in the course of the whole day.
Oh.
And there's something profoundly touching and about that. And it's the societal attitude thing as well, because I think the UK is guilty of it more, that you've written off at a certain age. Still, ageism is a real thing. We've got legislation against it. It's a load of BS, because when I see in the world of work, they'll say other things, like, oh, it's a bit overqualified. We're a vibrant culture. It's too old. They don't say it overtly because of legal repercussions. But whereas in Japan, when someone gets old, they're seen as a person of great wisdom and respect element and everything else, or generally in culture like in Italy, in the Middle East as well, the Iranian type of culture, which we're both got backgrounds in. There is that kind of sense of drawing towards Nana or your granddad or whatever it is, rather than just, oh, they're just old. And the US in some ways is good because, look, you've got, some people will say this is a good and bad thing, but you've got a president of 78. The last one was 74. It wouldn't happen here in the UK. I don't believe it would. So there's one thing good about that in terms of the US. But when we talk about this whole aspect, 85% of people are unhappy in what they do. And if you're unhappy, then it's going to affect your mental health. It's going to affect your well-being, and you're going to have that sense of isolation and loneliness. A lot of people are drifting through life because they don't know what they want, where they're going, or they're living a life of other people's values or other people's limitations. And it goes back to your point that they're not being authentic themselves. They're not living a life of passion and purpose. Design, living a life by design, is very much far removed. And culturally, that comes into play because Iranians as well can be guilty of this. I grew up, if you weren't a lawyer or a doctor or an engineer, and it's moved on now.
What are you?
Yeah, what are you? Who are you? So we're entering a world where the virtual is coming more and more a real thing that's dominating our lives. So the virtual people going out prior to the mobile phone, which maybe I'm sounding like a dinosaur, which I was even prior to the internet. When you were out, you were living the moment. You were having a conversation. Now you see so much generally of people just glued to their mobile phones, taking a picture, a video for Instagram, TikTok, etc., and actually losing the art of connecting and conversation, which has a big factor when it comes to being and our mental health. Because if we feel like we're never connected, no matter how much we're going out, then we'll have that sense of loneliness and isolation.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And loneliness, it's quite a subjective term. It's very different for different people. And incidentally, social media, unfortunately, has perpetuated that. We think that we're connecting, and we are connecting, as you mentioned, on a virtual level. But what happens when you're doom scrolling and you're constantly being hit by information and news? Johnny, we are bombarded with more content in a week than our ancestors had to deal with in a lifetime. Okay. Sometimes in a day. So we are really just bombarded with so much content and so much information. And the brain hasn't caught up yet. So from a neurological, from a cognitive perspective, we were able to process and understand and deal with the tragedies and the atrocities and the challenges of our community and our ecology, right? Now I know exactly what's happening on a refugee boat off the coast of Greece that may have nothing to do directly with me, but they really have triggered one of my values, which is a value of justice, which makes me feel incredibly uncomfortable and upset. But if I can't do anything in the moment or later on, then what happens is either we get desensitized to these constant bits of information that is coming our way, or we settle into this feeling of helplessness and hopelessness because we're constantly being hit with negative news or bad news. And you know what clickbait is like. They will spin the worst possible version of that story to hit us the hardest for us to fall into that trap, right? And then what happens is because we have these regular hits of bad news, even when we're not looking at our phone, we have this generalized sense of anxiety that something's about to happen. What's next? When is the next bad news or the next hit going to come at us? And a lot of people will constantly be checking their phone, not because that's become habituated to them, but because they're worried, they're anxious about what they don't know. And they need to know it. Not that they're going to do anything about it, but it sits into their system. And then what happens to our system? Our system turns into a lagoon of bad news and information that is very difficult to process and deal with, right? That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, Johnny, is think about it from a becoming more lonely, or social media perpetuating feeling of loneliness. I'm sitting at home. I've had a very tough week with all the work that I've had to do. And now I may be scrolling through Instagram and everybody's beautiful summer pictures of incredible holidays and with lots of friends and sunshine and yachts and music and restaurants and happiness. And even though logically I know that post is but an artificial, perhaps, drop in the bucket of that person's entire universe, I know that from a logical perspective, but my emotional brain or my reptilian brain picks that up as, wow, look at how much your life is less meaningful than these people's lives. Research now that is being conducted is analyzing and looking at a direct correlation between the number of hours people spend on their phones and mental health concerns that they may have, whether it's struggling with feelings of dissatisfaction in life, disappointment, and various other things. So social media, unfortunately, perpetuates loneliness from those two different angles. And I'm sure there's other angles. Going back to what you were mentioning in terms of what do we do about this and how do we improve the situation? I can't highlight enough the importance of self-awareness, Johnny. Any kind of mental health journey, self journey, spiritual journey has to start with understanding the power of self-awareness. And I think it was psychologist Carl Jung that said a while back, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate, right? So there's many faith related cultures and traditions in which they just say, this is how it's supposed to be. Maybe it's meant to be this way. Maybe it's the will of whatever I believe in. And we call it fate. But what happens is when you become more aware of who you are, you gain the power to design your destiny and to make these deliberate choices. And even though psychologists and philosophers throughout history, throughout time, in different studies or observational, informal settings have defined self-awareness as the ability to identify, understand, and articulate the things that make you who you are as an individual, including your personality, your actions, your strengths, your values, your beliefs, your emotions, your thoughts, all of that. It's in those moments when a person is self-focused rather than other-focused that you may use that moment or that interaction or interactions with external environments and people to compare yourself, to appraise and better understand who you are, but more importantly, who you want to be. Because we're not just human beings, right? We're human becomings. And everybody has a chance and an opportunity to pull up that blueprint that has been designed for them by others or by themselves. And maybe you haven't fulfilled or achieved certain elements on that blueprint. And pull it up, just pull it up, blow off the dust from it, roll it out, get back to the drawing board and think about what layers of me are truly authentically me and what layers have I inherited that are driving me into an existence that doesn't frankly generate joy. And I know you probably know this, Johnny. I was heading a business school for close to 5.5, 6 years. And during our commencement ceremonies, oftentimes I would address the students and the parents in a beautiful location in London, thousands of people. And I would often end my commencement speech by saying, please don't settle. When you settle, you become like dust. You're not dust. Dust settles. It's never too late for you to really understand who you are and better understand who you want to be, to design a life that generates joy. And I think we're all capable of that to varying degrees.
That was beautiful. Because the hardest and yet the most important conversation that we need to have is with ourselves. In a world where people are faking it, that you should never fake it with yourself. And until you do that, you'll never be able to be on the right trajectory.
A couple of years ago, Johnny spoke at Tedx, and my Tedx talk was, this talk is going to change your life. And within the first 10 seconds of the talk, I say to them, I'm so sorry to disappoint you, but I'm not going to do that. And neither is the billions of hits on Google. If you Google, this will change your life, there's trillions of hits of people, amateurs and experts alike, promising to have the solution to the best version of you just around the corner, right? We're on this transformational treadmill nonstop, but we're constantly being told what we should do and who we are And if you only do this, rather than reconnecting with our internal compass, rather than reconnecting with that internal voice of really nobody knows who you are. If a therapist spent the next 50 years with you, they still would not fully know you the way you know you. And so for us to be a little bit more aware of and awake to our internal compasses, because Johnny, you're home, you're resourceful, you're unique, incredibly unique, but we don't often tap into those resources as much as we should, because we're bombarded by voices, external voices telling us, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. But live in the moment. Be grateful. All these conflicting platitudes and cliches and messages that are coming at us without us pausing and saying, wait a minute, what works for me? What works for me? And apparently there was this really funny statistics that came out that said individuals travel 1,295 miles in the wrong direction every year due to the deference of Google Maps or GPS, the navigation system. Even though individuals may know how to get somewhere, they know the direction, they've been going there for 10 years, but this voice might tell us, go this way. And I don't know if you saw the headline. It was a 21-year-old girl who ended up in a lake just outside of London somewhere. And when they asked her, what happened? She said, oh, I'm very embarrassed, but I was just following the sat nav and I ended up in this lake. Now, she's more fortunate than many of us, Johnny, because she can see the consequence of following an external voice. Yet many of us end up in metaphoric lakes that we may not even know that could be potentially drowning us. And so my whole mission is, in terms of mental health advocacy, is saying, I would like to be the vehicle and the conduit to bring empirical research along with millions of other people who are doing it so well in many different spaces. But I would like to bring that empirical accurate information to individuals, but then it's up to them to also utilize their internal navigation systems, their internal moral compasses, to have a better understanding of who they are, to consolidate this information, to be able to design their life.
Yeah. Just thinking about a lot of the stuff that you said, because people don't realize, I think something like 1 in 400 trillion chance of us should actually being here. 1 in 400 trillion chance of actually us being. That's how unique you really are. Going back to that imposter syndrome of comparison type thing that so many people do now because of social media, etc. And they see all these people, good looking people on Instagram and TikTok and living this life, that Dolce Vita, and they feel, oh, their life is so great. And they come back and look at themselves and they think, my life sucks. And they become miserable. But nobody knows what goes on behind closed doors. Some of those people that we think that are living this amazing life may be some of the most unhappy people that there are. What does fulfillment mean? Because isn't it a case that we're all searching fulfillment for mental health, happiness, and well-being?
Yeah. So do you mean, what does it mean for me, or what does it mean generally?
Both.
Okay. I think for me, it means a few things. I think for me, it means family, health, adventures, doing work that aligns with my values and with my goals, celebrating achievement, having moments of awe, doing things for the first time and experiencing that sense of novelty and creativity. Fulfillment means having enough empathy and compassion to not only care for yourself, but to contribute to your community, to help others, to make a difference, make a positive impact. These are the variables, I think, that contribute to my sense of fulfillment. I think from looking at it from an other's perspective, you shared a stat with us earlier. Those individuals at work are unfulfilled or feel unsatisfied with their job. If you think about it, we spend a significant portion of our life at work, 1/3 at work, 1/3 sleeping, and the other third, everything else. And I can't highlight enough how important sleep is, by the way. If we could have a separate discussion entirely based on the importance of sleep and proper sleep hygiene. But when you look at that statistic and you look at the kinds of people often talk about midlife crisis, having a midlife crisis. I have always been fascinated in the quarter life crisis, which happens around 24, 25, 26, 27, those years. A lot of individuals at 18, 19, 20, they think they figured it out. They know what's best. They have it all. They know better than their parents. They know better than everybody else. And then come 23, 24, 25, there's this almost rude awakening of what does all this mean? Where am I going? What am I doing? And so I think that's a pivotal point and crossroads in which a lot of individuals might either break away from all the programming and the societal shaping that they've experienced and carve out a much more authentic and self-aware path, or they fall into those traps of, oh, all my friends are getting married, so I need to be getting married. All my friends are having babies by this age. How come I don't have a baby? And then what happens? We try and squeeze people who don't fit into our plan. We force them into our blueprint simply because the blueprint and societal programming during this quarter life period dictates that's who we should be, and that's what we should be doing. So when you become slave to that programming, Johnny, that's moving further and further away from fulfillment. Fulfillment is knowing who you are, knowing that you have made deliberate decisions to be who you are, to design who you are and what you want to engage in and who you want to surround yourself with and who you have chosen to be your life partner and the way that you'd like to live from there forth on. So for me, fulfillment for others is agency, having the control to forge their own path towards what makes them happy. And that's different for everybody.
Happiness and fulfillment is so intertwined, and you can't have one without the other. And in order to have happiness, it takes courage. It takes courage because you can't have happiness without freedom. And it takes courage to have freedom of options, freedom of choices, living a life that's free. People want to feel free in some description. A lot of people are slave to the wage. A lot of people live in golden cages where they feel like there's no way out because they have a mortgage, they have rent, they've got kids. They can't do that thing that they want to do, that business, that career pivot because of this, because of that. And then intertwined with all of that, you then have things like trauma and generational trauma, which is a handed down thing from one generation to another. And this then intertwines all together into the topic as we come towards more the end of this podcast. And that is woman life freedom in the Iran Revolution. Because what's gone on in Iran in terms of the trauma that people have suffered for 44 years, the generation trauma as well within that, the fact that they live in an open prison, the fact that they want the basic rights that we enjoy in the West, to be able to go out with a boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever your sexual preference, to be able to just live a life that's true to themselves and a life that's free. The most beautiful catchphrase of all time, the most beautiful slogan of all time, in my opinion, one of them at least, is woman life freedom. How does this all now intertwine with what we're seeing and all the stuff that you've been doing on social, Instagram, etc., and you've got a big following with the Iran Revolution and woman life freedom in terms of your mental health is your wealth, your health is your wealth, and your well-being, and the sense of freedom and being free?
It's how long has it been now? Since September. When I say September, the sort of birth of women, life, freedom, the slogan has existed prior to September, but many of us living in the diaspora, Iranians in the diaspora, may not have been involved in the day-to-day news or activities of what was happening in Iran in the last 44 years. But of course, very aware of the atrocities, the oppression, and the challenges that people have lived through. We're aware of that because of how difficult it is for people to immigrate to host countries. But yet, Iranians are desperate and have always been desperate in droves to be able to find countries that will offer them a happier existence, a life that is more satisfying, enjoying the freedoms that some of which you have named. That takes tremendous sacrifice, Johnny. First of all, can you imagine how difficult your circumstances might be, or how ambitious people are because they want better for themselves, they want to do better. And Iranians are often referred to as the silent minorities in the diaspora because they're educated, they're hardworking, they're committed, and they rise amongst the ranks, and they really are able to achieve great things. I'm super proud of what individuals living in different host countries have been able to achieve. So much that one of the reasons I studied this particular topic for my PhD, I wanted to study cultural identity transformation. That's what I set out to study. What happens to immigrants, sojourners, international students? To a certain extent, I also looked at refugees. What happens to these individuals when they leave their home country to live in a host country for a period of time? What changes? What stays the same? And then what are some repatriation concerns when they go back to their country of origin? And for Iranians, Johnny, there's endless, countless stories of people who had to get separated and disconnected from their home, from their country, from their loved ones, from their community, to have to learn a new language, to have to be told that your education is meaningless and you have to now go back to university to get a conversion course. The bullying and the hardship that their children experience while going through schools, the marriages that they missed, the funerals that they were not able to attend, and the list goes on and on. And the reason I share this with you is because when I say I wasn't directly involved with the activities of in Iran, that means I was never an advocate or an activist. But nevertheless, the repercussions and the ripple effect of the last 44 years has touched us all in various degrees, and it's still oppressing us. Every time a person who's born in Tehran walks through immigration, even though they have their passport is from France, and they get pulled aside and they get questioned, this is the impact that we're facing. Every time that I think about the family members that I don't know because I never got a chance to know them because we're dispersed in all different parts of the world, this is a psychological trauma or difficulty that we go through that we have to take into consideration. I remember being at a friend's house once during Christmas, and she had about 42 members of her family there at Christmas dinner. And I was only 17 years old, but I could sense that pang of envy of how wonderful it is that they're surrounded by so many of their loved ones and their friends. Now, when I told her, she said, "Oh, you can have them all." They're all drama and chaos and problems and so on. I don't want them. You can keep them. But we have experienced it differently. Come September, and now the atrocities and the oppression is seen, experienced, expressed on a level that I think none of us have experienced previously. And so I got much more ingrained, especially from a mental health aspect. Johnny, I think there's a lot to be said about people staying in their own lane to a certain extent to be able to do what they're good at. And the only reason I say that, again, is because of misinformation. In times like this, it's very important to be able to say and do the right things, or else it could entirely potentially derail a movement if there's misinformation spread. And that's one of the strategies that they use in this oppressive regime, right? To confuse, to create chaos, and to create disconnection. And so this is important to me as an Iranian. It's important to me as a woman, both two of my identities that are very, I think, have become much more pronounced throughout these last 10 or 11 months. I do what I can to be the voice of those inside. I don't claim to understand all the political nuances, the rules and regulations, the advocacy that takes place from a political perspective, but I do understand suffering, and I do understand the impact that trauma can have on not only on one generation, but on many. And Johnny, there are some circumstances and situations that we should not just adapt to. Unfortunately, many of the people or loved ones inside that country have gotten used to or adapted dysfunctionally to things that human beings should not get used to. Being yelled at on the street because a piece of material is not on your head is very difficult to comprehend and to process and to have to live with. And that's just a drop in the bucket of many of the sort of unfair rules and regulations and the pressures that are put on young women and men in many domains and dimensions. And Johnny, we all have what I refer to in this circumstance as a moral injury. We're not just helpless. We're not just feeling hopeless. We're not just sad and anxious. We're not worried. We're not just angry. I want you to put that all together. And this results in a concept referred to as moral injury, which means our values of belief in justice, fairness, equality, happiness, health, and all these variables have been triggered and questioned and have been amputated by witnessing or taking part in what's been happening in the last 10 or 11 months. Our morality, our ethics has been questioned and injured. It's become so fragile and broken that it's hard to recover from that. What does anything mean anymore? And that wonderful expression that says if oppression is happening or injustice is happening, then none of us are free. And that our sense of empathy has become quite heightened and amplified. And I do what I can, Johnny, to try and be their voice and to provide them with a sense of relief and understanding what they're experiencing, helping them put a name to it, and perhaps offering some solutions that may help in the short term and hopefully in the long term.
Yeah, the young population of Iran has one of the highest suicide rates in the region. They have one of the highest unemployment rates in the region. So you take a society where you have a regime that tries to take away hope, because as they say in Brazil, hope is the last thing to die, and opportunity, you lead to a brain drain like never before. 8 million Iranians, they say, they were across to diaspora. Not because they wanted to, because they wanted a life like other people have in terms of the normal basic opportunities and basic elements, security or stability or opportunity, being able to express yourself. And tied in with that, you have a revolution, which at the beginning said, we ask for one thing, please be our voice, which is what you're doing, because it goes back to that Rumi quote. I've said this to Omid Jalili, alone we're a drop in the ocean, together we become the ocean. And we all do our bit in these great things. Trauma has two effects. The negative effect, it can be very destructive, cause havoc with your mental health and your psychology. The positive effect is like, to use a different example altogether, what happened with Oprah Winfrey. She went through hell upbringing. It made her, in terms of she wouldn't allow her circumstances to define who she is, because we don't control what we're born in, but we can control how we react to it. Well, so hopefully now the mindset is right, that people in Iran have said, you know what, enough of outsourcing that pen for someone else to write our story, other powers. We want to take Iran back and get rid and be done with this anti-regime, anti-Iranian ayatollahs for the last 44 years. As we come to the very end of the podcast, you now would be success in terms of your career?
Yeah, I think I'm at a point in my career in which I would like to continue making a positive impact. And I'll share with you a quote that I often start my presentations with. And it doesn't matter if I'm presenting in front of a group of engineers at Intel or Cisco, or if I'm speaking to a class of 80 15-year-old when I'm running a campaign about anti-bullying. And this quote is a Native American quote that says, "We don't inherit the world from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children." And success to me, Johnny, is when I borrow something from someone, and that's our children, that I give it back to them, hopefully in a slightly better form than I found it. No generation has ever been perfect. No generation will be. We all have our differences, but there's no doubt that we have evolved and we have made positive impact. And we really should be grateful and appreciative of those things. Social media and the algorithms associated with technology and the virtual world highlights and emphasizes the loudest voices, creating a sensation of divisiveness and division amongst us. Or we have to reconnect again and think about all that we have to be appreciative of and fortunate about, and tap into our self-awareness of what could I do to make a positive impact, to give the world back to this generation in a slightly better form than I found it. That to me is success.
I think that's wonderful because it comes back to life. For me, the ultimate success is living a meaningful life, which is number one, having a meaningful career. Number two, having a meaningful relationship. Number three, trying to make a difference. And you're making a difference. We all make a difference. Having this conversation makes a difference. So I really appreciate you and your time. There's been so much that we've unpacked there. How can people reach out to you in terms of your best socials or contact details?
Yeah, people can reach out to me on Instagram. My handle is at Dr. Shaheem on Instagram, and LinkedIn is a good way as well. And that's Samina Shaheem. That will come up on LinkedIn. And I very much look forward to hearing from people if they need my support in any shape or form, or if they have certain topics that they wish for me to talk more about, or that they want to further their knowledge or skills about a particular area. And so I'd be more than happy to hear from them. And thank you very much, Johnny, for inviting me to be able to achieve my purpose a little bit more through hopefully reaching more people through this conversation.
This has been Successful Iranians, and this has been Dr. Samina